This is program number 636, February 13th, 1984. It's Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. I appreciate your calling in. The first half of this program before World Watchers is the talk show. We don't have time for all the calls, so we'll take them next week. Maybe I'll have shorter answers, and we'll share some more information together before this part, the more formal part of the program goes on. We begin each week with a review of what happened last year. As I say every year and every week, the time goes so quickly. It's hard to keep track of the way the years spin. A year ago tonight, it was actually February 14th, 1983, I was talking about the interconnecting news events that were all coming together, the same names, the same banks, the same personalities, but came under various titles. One was the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, and Roberta Calvi, the president of that bank, was murdered in 1982 and 1983. The scandals about his murder, the body was exhumed, the missing money was questioned, and then the second scandal was the Vatican Bank, the Institute for Religious Works, and the links of Roberta Calvi to the Vatican Bank and Michael Sindona, who's in jail in New York City for breaking the Franklin Bank, one of the largest bank failures in the United States, and the relationship of the CIA and the Mafia and the missing billions to the Vatican Bank, and the drug bust in Milan, the worldwide murderers, the Nazis, the Mafia, the drugs linked to the Vatican Bank and linked to Banco Ambrosiano, and the gun running, many people being caught, arms merchants, and various personalities that we talked about just a year ago this evening, and murders and attempted murders. God's banker, Michael Sindona, is wanted for extradition in Italy for hiring some people to kill a judge, an investigator into the interconnecting links of the Vatican and the Mafia and the gun running. He hasn't been sent over there. He's in New York. And the various bank robberies that connect money for Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele's that tie also into the Odessa, the network, the Nazi network linked to the Vatican. And so the Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, the drugs, the gun running, the murders, the bank robberies, the Cold War that ties into that, the writers from the Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies, particularly Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen and Marvin Kalb getting into the act, and then the Vatican art scandal that was breaking through the United Nations and the United States mafiosa and Roberta Calvi. All of that has been in a state of turmoil. All these various 8 different segments have been in a state of turmoil this past year, and we were talking about those just a year ago. And also a year ago, I did a 2-part broadcast analysis of a brilliant article with a lot of information in it on John J. McCloy. It was called Minister Without Portfolio. It came out in Harper's February 83 by Alan Brinkley. I copied that article. It's about a 10 or 20-page article, and if you want that for the cost of printing it and the postage, if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope with a couple of stamps, it's heavy, and a couple of dollars for the printing, that's a very important article on the career, particularly the links of John McCloy from World War II, the end of World War II, and his locations and his work with I.G. Farben and in France, just before France fell. He was there 10 years and worked. He was the person responsible with Earl Warren for rounding up the Japanese in concentration camps, and of course his constant links to Henry Kissinger and Chase Manhattan. He became president of Chase Manhattan and was on the Warren Commission. McCloy is one of these people who covers the whole era. Wherever there is a major banking, high-level conspiracy, he's in it, and it was a pretty good article. Now, just since that year, there's been a lot of update on those stories, of course. This past week, another story in the New York Times, it was also in the Wall Street Journal, I might have mentioned it, payment by Vatican Bank seen. And this article says that the Vatican Bank is going to come up with $230 million to settle an account for Banco Ambrosiano because the Latin American companies where the money was lent to them that were inoperative were controlled by the Vatican Bank. There were 10 dummy fronts down in Panama where hunks of millions of dollars were going, 1.2 billion, were going to military dictatorships and death squads in Central and South America. The location of the money, some of it has never been identified. The Vatican sold a construction company last week for $20 million that they owned in Italy. And they said, it's pretty funny, they may have to take out a loan to pay the $230 million. There's 88 non-Italian banks that blame the Banco Ambrosiano and their links to the Vatican Bank for the banks going behind all of these millions of dollars. And while the Vatican isn't saying we're totally responsible, they say this is a goodwill gesture. We'll put up $230 million to cover those, in quotes, inoperative Latin American companies, which, as I say, were dummy fronts. And so now they're coughing up the money for that, which is a good way of admitting that, yes, they were tangled into dummy fronts in Panama and with the dictatorships. And the Vatican is putting up this money and not punishing Paul Marcinkus, who was behind it. So you know that they had to be behind all of this all along. They wouldn't be coughing up the money and still keeping him protected inside the Vatican. Just last week, a very important person died in Italy, General Giuseppe Santovito, Santovito, 65 years old. He was arrested and, of course, like many other people, never went to trial. I'm wondering if Klaus Barbie will go to trial. General Santovito was the former head of Italy's military intelligence. That'd be like having Daniel Graham from our Defense Intelligence Agency. That's how high up he was. He was revealing secret information about Italian terrorists, and that's the important part about his dying now before going to trial because of their foreign links, which would go, of course, to Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and the CIA. He died in prison, or he was released from prison for liver surgery and died, and according to the San Francisco Chronicle, he had links with the multi-billion-dollar arms and the drug trafficking ring in the Mideast. So there again is your weapons and your drug trafficking and your Masonic Lodge and your terrorism, and working with Licio Gelli, who was with Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and Franco, so that the Vatican is coughing up the money for one part of their debt, the scandal this year down from the linked with the Banco Ambrosiano, and one of the primary witnesses to the terrorism in Italy and to the P2 that would link to the CIA dies before he goes to trial. And of course, this week, as soon as Yuri Andropov died, the night news service had a story repeated in the San Francisco Chronicle. The author says Brezhnev tried to arrest Andropov, and the whole gist of the story is that the Soviet Union was paralyzed more than the people in Rome when the assassination attempt took place on the Pope, and they again thought that Andropov had a role in having the Pope killed, and if he would have the Pope killed, he wouldn't hesitate to do anything to them. That's just a roundabout way of trying to link on the death of Andropov, the assassination attempt on the Pope. Now, that investigation's been going on in Italy for a long time now, for 2 years, and they can't scratch a KGB connection in there. That comes from Georgetown and Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen. But they wait till Andropov is dead and then try to come out with that connection again. It will be heard over and over again, the Korean airline crash and the assassination attempt on the Pope. And I hear it on radio and TV. If you want to say something about the Soviet Union, you say, because of this, how can you trust them? And yet the provocateur element is kept out of it. That would clear the very people that they're saying were behind the operations. Well, I have news that may not surprise many of you, but the Rebel magazine is over. It's folded. It has had its last copy. If you listen every week to this program, or if you want back tapes, I started on November 14th. That was broadcast 623, saying on that broadcast, Larry Flynt, be careful. But he already was under the control of people, out of control of his mind, totally zonked, and nothing could happen except the eventual collapse of the rebel. There was nothing but insanity down there from the time that he got the idea of getting it started. And the first 5 or 6 issues were really good. If you want some of those articles, what I'll do, because they're not available now, is copy segments like Paul Laxalt and the Mafia, or Colonial Dignidad, and the Vicki Morgan stories, and I'll let you know how many pages they are. And if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll make those available for you as separate I can't stand to copy the whole issue, but if there's specific articles, I'll put them together, and then you can get them if you want to order them at cost, and just send the postage stamp and the money for the printing if you didn't get a hold of them. I did many broadcasts on what was going down there, as much as I could tell you on the air. Broadcast 623, 624, 625, 626, 627, on up to last week, 635. And I sort of detailed what was happening. It's too bad. Bob Cutler has a newsletter, and he put in the newsletter, if anybody wants the copy of the tape. He didn't know I did a lot of them. Tapes on the shenanigans, he's put in his newsletter, engineered in Larry Flint's house and office by G. Gordon Liddy, Gordon Novell, Mitchell Werbell, and so forth. Write to Mae Brussell and get the tape on the Rebel. Well, I got a letter today. It was for Mr. Truby, who publishes that book on the silencers, the ones that he has Mitchell Werbell in. He sent a letter with his $5 asking me for the tape on Mitchell Werbell and Gordon Novell and G. Gordon Liddy at Larry Flint's house. Remember, I did a continuous series of tapes, but he sent his money asking for the broadcast. And I did mention, I think, that I got from his book, there's pictures of Mitchell Werbell in there. So I guess he wants to hear what I was saying. That was the one, like, how would you like to have these guys for dinner? So he's ordered that tape. That's the man who published and printed the book on the silencers, which is one of the big stories of the century, the use of silencers for political assassinations, long overlooked and never given enough attention except by the people who make them and use them, not the victims or the victims' families. The last issue of Rebel was John Kennedy on the cover, and of course it was a section of the book Farewell America. William Turner told how he got a hold of the book, and there's a lot of good material in there. It's a very good article and cover for the end of Rebel, because what the men from the French intelligence said when they wrote Farewell America is that if you don't catch on to who killed John Kennedy, your country, to paraphrase, is really gone. You're through. This is your last chance to do anything about this situation. It's Farewell Rebel and it's Farewell America. The issue has part 2 of Colonial Dignidad. It's got an interview with Seymour Hersh. It's a very sad story about Seymour Hersh, his frustration of trying to tell people about Henry Kissinger, and not only getting his book out, but working on it 6 years, but about a week after he gets it out, Henry Kissinger gets appointed to the Committee on Central America. I called Seymour Hersh in Washington when Kissinger got the appointment and said, now will you do the story on Fritz Kramer with me? There is nothing in this country as important as General Fritz Kramer, the man behind the Pentagon, behind the death squads in Vietnam, in South Korea, in Southeast Asia, all of it, Cambodia bombings, you name it, the overthrow of the Shah, putting the Shah in, the overthrow of Mossadegh, in Guatemala, in Dominican Republic, the coup in the United States with Haig, Kissinger, and the Bay of Pigs and the CIA agents with their SS, Waffen-SS Nazis. Wherever the blood was spilled, the bottom line is Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. And the Rockefellers, of course, and John McCoy, all in one nest. But there's nobody more important than Fritz Kramer. And it's a sad article. It's doubly sad for me to see things go down and see that people are not in control or cannot work as a team and say, yes, I'll go after that. As I was saying, the first part of this broadcast before World Watchers started, are there 5 people who listened to the talk show that would sit down and talk about the bloodbath in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, what is going on in the world, in Lebanon and Syria, bombing these people, killing women and children, and just blood spilling everywhere, and Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and what went on down there. Are there people that want to sit and talk about, well, Seymour, he says he's working on another book. It's an interview of him in Rebel that's very good. I wish he'd pick up the phone someday and say, yes, Mae Brussell, I'm ready to go on the Fritz Kramer story. I'll go with you, we'll do it. And then we'll find out who Henry Kissinger really is. Also in the last issue of Rebel is a long section on Edwin Meese And part of the book, Ronald Reagan's Ruling Class. There is a very good book out, but it's like $28. So if you can't get it, you can get sections of it. And there's one on laundering drug money. And as I say, the Seymour Hersh interview. So the rebel is dead and gone. There was nothing but insanity that came down. The whole place, from the time that Larry Flynt decided to go against Larry McDonald and put the ads in the paper, that's when the downfall really began, I think. And then to add rebel on top of it, you all know what happened. Now, last week, Althea Flynt, the wife of Larry Flynt, was in court. She was pleading, she was told she pleaded guilty to assault on a special deputy, a U.S. Marshal, that took place in November, that she'd get a misdemeanor. But her behavior in court, the judge didn't like her behavior in court last week, so he gave her a sentence, an additional charge, made her plead guilty to a felony assault instead of the agreement ahead of time, and they sentenced her to 3 years in prison and $5,000 fine. I called down there. At first, I thought I'd go to L.A. to see if I could help her. I want to see Johnny Meyer down there. He's framed, and he's in jail waiting a murder charge trial down in L.A. I don't even know what I can do, because when I tell people what I think can be done, they don't listen, and it takes 5 or 10 years for them to come back and say, oh, yeah, I guess you were right, or I guess the government does this or something. There's absolutely nothing I can say about that situation. Larry Flynt is going to South Carolina, and one reason I read that sad story about the letter Marilyn Monroe winding out of the mental hospital last week is that 1 year later she was dead. These people just took on too much too fast, and the American system isn't going to let them say those things. You can do pornography and you can do all the videotapes, but you can't take on this system, and particularly Ronald Reagan. Larry Flynt was a citizen of Ohio. He did live in California during the Reagan years. He was out of Ohio and then moved to California after he had been shot, and he'd opened up the office and bought the Free Press, and the hustler moved out here, but he didn't live through the Reagan years or else didn't do his homework, and there was no strategy on how to handle these people. Now, if you don't believe that Larry Flynt wasn't totally out of his mind a little while ago, by October, read the article in Vanity Fair. A listener sent it to me. It's called Larry Flynt Hustling the American Dream. It's a picture of Larry wearing the American flag as a diaper, but it is filled with real Larry Flynt and then the insanity, the symptoms of the sickness. And it has all kinds of interesting, confusing things in there, and it tells him riding with his security chief, Bill Ryder, and all of them with their armed guns, wearing their loaded holsters, a half a dozen of these security guards. All of the security guards have been fired, and of course Bill Ryder is out, and there are scandals involving Ryder and his wife that I don't even know. I'm privy to some of it. I can't even put that on the air. It's so complicated down there. Then the article refers, he was on the airplane with somebody from CNN and Vanity Fair who were doing stories. And so this guy's doing the account, and he introduces, this is Gordon Novell, Chairman Emeritus Force One Limited New Orleans, whatever that introduction, that's the title that he had given Gordon Novell, and it tells about him flying with them and various little things that Larry would talk about that sound like Mae Brussell, like Henry Kissinger's a Nazi. How do you think he can wander around the Middle East and kiss a Jew one day and an Arab the next? That's Mae Brussell. And he's got little things in it that sound like things that I've said to him. But in between, his conversation about, Gordon Novell and all of them, John DeLorean, is so sad and pathetic. And he tells her how he's going to get out Rebel on November 22nd for the anniversary of the assassination. And another magazine that Chic he has, and Gentleman's Companion, and The Mole is fairly new. And he was buying a whole fleet of airplanes and talking about various things that were coming down and throwing out names. And the article has a list of some of the names that he uses. And then it says that on the plane he starts drinking his blue-green manna. I've told you about that. He says, make sure you mention in the article, and I'm glad the author did so you have the record, make sure you mention blue-green manna. And he starts dropping a thick brownish liquid into his mouth from a small bottle labeled algae extract. Blue-green manna is what Moses fed the masses with Jesus Christ, too. He's telling the writer there. He says, this is all these Jews were running around the desert, starving to death, and then they were eating this manna, and J.C. fed 5 loaves. He said they were giving him manna, and he says, I'm the new kid on the block, and he licks his blue-green manna off his fingers like molasses, and he's telling them that's what's giving him his strength. And then the article from Vanity Fair says how he says, I'm paralyzed from the waist down, but I'm not paralyzed from the waist up. So he's going after the system. They asked him at this point in October who was on his list that he liked. And he names his favorite people: Madeleine Murray O'Hare, Timothy Leary, G. Gordon Liddy, and John DeLorean. Now, this is at the time he's going to get out rebel. I mean, this, it's such a contradiction. The man was already talking so silly about these people. If you're going to get one thing out and you're so smart, all of a sudden these are his heroes. And he's throwing out other names in the article. And it's an interesting thing. And then it quotes Alan Graham, who's his bodyguard, who arranges his trip to New York. And Alan Graham has been fired. And there is another story out of this. Incidentally, that Baron who represented Althea Flint in court is connected in, well, I guess I can say the news stories will be coming out Time magazine, to Vicki Morgan. He's representing Marvin Pancoast, but he also was close to Vicki Morgan. And there's a lot of big scandals coming out of Hollywood and around these circles that I'm not privy to really give the details of now, but this was some nest going on down there. Alan Graham was fired and Ryder was fired, and the article talks about him. And then he's in New York. He's staying at the Park Lane Hotel, and this article says, elegance enters round 6 in the person of Harold Price Farringer, the aristocratic lawyer of Klaus von Bülow case. So he wants him to be his lawyer. Larry Flint wants the lawyer for Klaus von Bülow to represent him at the Supreme Court hearing. So he touches bases with every controversial trial and every Nazi and every fascist, and he's supposed to be getting out this poor rebel that hardly gets launched. That thing just sinks because of the mass confusion and the boss going nuts, and people moving in. It didn't have it had a chance if some sane people had total control of it, but that wasn't meant to be, and so it isn't anymore. Also, this article describes Althea Flint flying in from Los Angeles with her hair was blue then, and then she was purple. 2 earrings through her ear and 1 through her nose, like a restless teenager on the bed with a telephone. But she's a bright woman, and they asked her, what do you think of all this? And she said, I want to get my husband away from these weirdos. I think it's crazy. I want to get everything back to normal. She recognized that as hectic as their life was and is, nothing there, and this was in October, was sane. And she said they were the crazies, and there had been an invasion of people. You can't finger one, a total invasion. And then the two of them end up with 15 months and 3 years. She gets 3 years in jail, and he gets 15 months. She gets more than him for an incursion in the court. I hope she gets out. She's out now, but boy, is that a sad, sad story. So anyway, I'll send one tape to J. David Truby. He has a national news service, that's what he calls himself, out of Indiana, Pennsylvania, and he wanted the tape on the antics of Liddy, Novell, and Wordbell concerning Larry Flint's new magazine, The Rebel, which I thought was kind of interesting. Well, there's 2 things that are in the news all the time that bore me to death, and I think if I talk about them just for 1 minute each, that'll cover the subject. One has to do with what's going on in Lebanon. It's just an extension of Ronald Reagan's disease. I'll put our army everywhere, I'll do anything, and he's an extension of a policy that goes back to Henry Kissinger and Daniel Graham and the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon setting up this mess. They decided, the Nazis after World War II and the Vatican and the whole Monte Carlo Lodge and that gang, they decided we're going to have a Christian as the head of Lebanon, and he's going to be a Jamal, the great dope dealers from carrying all the ports as their bases. So the New York Times has a front page story this week. Survival of Jamal appears threatened. and then the lead above it, no place to go. Well, they can go into the ocean. That's one place they can go. Israel played footsie with the dope dealers, with the Phalange fascists, and they are parlayed now into a thing that can be discussed and sold out, just as the Camp David Accord. I never celebrated that, and I have more to update you on the sellout of that. And Mubarak has thrown the whole thing out. What went on when Sadat was murdered was completely turning back Egypt with the PLO and the other Arab countries, which they finalized this past week. And Germany is selling the weapons to Saudi Arabia. Israel was foolish. They're dumb. And they did all the wrong things, and they're supposed to be a smart people, and if they have to be sacrificed, they will. And that Middle East situation involves so many factors. And we think if we have ships and we can shoot, if we have enough ammunition, we can shoot. That's all we need, and that's our foreign policy until somebody comes along and decides that's no policy at all. And the tragedy is that it's an election year, and the fools in Washington just ran up a $21 million bill traveling and eating fancy places and dining and probably getting payoffs on the side that neutralize every opinion. They come home like zombies, total zombies. And so the Congress has to be either pushed aside where the people express what they want or the people take what they get, which is about what they're going to have. There's another story in the Los Angeles Times, a long story, about 2 pages, Reagan Foreign Policy, a Lesson in Fate. You notice if Jimmy Carter did this, it would be an error of the Democrats. All the Democrats would be at fault. When Ronald Reagan does it, he has the press so coddled that if something goes wrong, it's fate. If anybody else does it, their decisions were bad, or they're not patriotic, or they're not loyal Americans. They have the nerve to call his mistakes inevitable when he has done nothing but brandish around the weapons and the hot talk and the war talk continuously. Another story in the New York Times, aides say president started pullback process weeks ago. I'll tell you that Reagan plays the press like the Stradivarius. He is a total genius because they do anything he wants. If we're supposed to be out, he says, I wanted it 2 weeks ago. If they're kicked out, he doesn't say, I lost. He says, it's my idea. It's hard to meet a man as suave and as brilliant as Ronald Reagan. Now, he used the Uri and drop-off death to just perfection. He makes the idea sound that I will meet on and have peace. I want peace. It's up to the Russians. We want peace. It's the Russians that don't want peace. Maybe a change in government. We'll have peace. And then every station says, who's going to be the new ruler of Russia? Is this one more minded to d'entente than the other one? And they list 5 possibilities. And they go down this list, and the papers are filled with biographies. Which one will open up now to our goals? We want peace. And this is so bright. They take the death of this man and they make it sound like the only thing between world peace and our administration is up to them. Well, the Soviet Union printed just a small article in the magazine New Times just last week, and maybe it was the last thing that Andropov wrote or said, and it had to do with the meeting in Sweden about arms negotiations in Stockholm, where Andropov's son attended. And here's a few items from this short article saying that America says that it's up to the Russians to move a few weapons or missiles. It said the United States spent $105 billion on bases in 1982, and they just increased it to $133 billion on European bases alone last year. $133 billion. Since Vietnam War, they set up 178 bases in West Germany alone. We have 178 military bases in Germany alone. 359 major installations are outside the United States, plus the ones that the Pentagon has free access with. $8.5 billion was spent in construction on military bases, one half of it outside the United States, 4.2 or 3. $1.4 billion for launching missiles. $93 million has been allocated for the Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean, close to Russia. $93 million. $143 million for 55 new projects in South Korea. We've had 200 armed conflicts since Vietnam War, 177 cases where the Navy was brought in, 106 aircraft carriers were used. We transport on each carrier 90 aircraft with 110 110,000 tons. And after using the carriers to bomb Vietnam, they even brought them down to Grenada. And this brief item is some of the budgets outside of the United States and how they're talking about limited nuclear war and atomic bombs in Siberia. So we say, we want peace, but why don't you talk to us? We'll take a 1-minute break and then do some more on that story. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. This is broadcast number 636, and it's February the 13th, 1984. I've been doing a lot of reading on the mental programs, going back to the Tavistock Clinic finally. I've had material for years, and I got some from a friend back east and somebody up north, and I've been studying that in conjunction with the work. I have enough now for a book on Grenada. It was supposed to be a 5-part story for the rebel, but now I have a choice. I can enlarge it and put in the stuff that wasn't included and try to get a book out, or I can cut it down and then maybe just send it in as a single article and reduce it like I did the Korean Airlines story. But I've been doing a lot on mental hospital investigation again. I've done a lot already, but it's very important. And the the manipulation of society by the psychologists and the sociologists, because of the Dr. Jeffrey Byrne coming from that Yerkes Primate Center in Atlanta, Georgia, to be the vice chancellor with the students down in Grenada, and his son Jeffrey Byrne, who worked for the Defense Department and the CIA and in Vietnam and mind control experiments, and with the White House plumbers and Henry Kissinger and Egil Crow before he went on to Jimmy Carter. Studying the Byrnes, I had to go more into mental institutions because there's a pattern here that I have to delve farther in, just like I got that breakthrough a few years ago into the Vatican connections. I've always known that the mind control, the control of society, is one of the most important factors of manipulating all of us into being the zombies we become. And I began studying books and articles on the way that Great Britain controlled their colonies and how their British psychologists worked with Hitler's psychologists and controlled masses with very few policemen visible. And then these people worked with the OSS and with British intelligence, and then came to the United States into Harvard and Columbia and MIT and Pennsylvania, and began their mind control experiments on society at large and on us, that's us, continuing the process of the British Empire of how you control large masses in the hands of a few. I have always said that the increase of the dope in this country is what Great Britain did to China with the pouring in the narcotics to keep them subdued, keep you busy, keep you sick, keep you earning the money to pay it, and take your mind off of things. So that the mental health, the mental status is very important to what is happening now, particularly as more people seem to be phasing out of the living game and just into the accepting and the entertaining game. The home box office is like I can go home tonight and see Stravinsky's ballet, and I look at the TV guide, what is there of interest Thursday night? It's the Sidney Riley, and all of a sudden, if you want to be a zombie, I limit it to 2 programs. If you want to be a zombie, start with 5 and you're hooked. There was a story about Ronald Reagan running again, and the New York Times mentioned that his mental health, his physical condition is fine, and that his mental health seems to be all right. They said no one who interviewed him said that he's not keen or alert, judging by his speeches, by the State of the Union message, and his public appearances or his sense of humor. Now, if I were doing a diagnosis, I would say that the 2 signs that the man is mentally sick are his sense of humor and his speech, the State of the Union message. Because if you would take just the articles that Mae Brussell, not computerized, just Mae Brussell cut, of domestic problems in the United States in terms of things affecting all our lives, whether it's poison in the foods or pollution or table legs coming in from Mexico with radiation, and surgical problems and causing cancer by chemotherapy, medical abuse of people, the financial scandals, the mafia, the drug arrests, the massive drug arrests, the scandals in the courts, and the various things that are going on now, you have to know that something is wrong out there. And in his great speech to the nation on his State of the Union, he said that the country is stronger and more secure than ever before. He goes on the philosophy that if we have the more guns and the more bases, then we're the more secure. That isn't true. It wasn't true in Iran, where you had a handful of native population, and the Shah had every technique and every radio device and spying device necessary to keep the native population under control. Societies change, and when they've had enough, there's going to be an upheaval, just as they got rid of the military dictatorship in Greece that wants to come back, and the military dictatorship in Argentina. He says, never before we've been more secure, and he said America's out of its worst crisis in post-war history, and we've met the rising problem of failing confidence in the 1970s. If you listen to Phil Donahue and the teenagers, over 1 million that are pregnant, and the incidence of abortions, the millions of people aborted, and the people in jails and adding new jails, more jails, and the squads, the police squads. This is not a country of peaceful or happy people. It's a country of people who are so pacified, like babies with pacifiers in their mouth and everything to please them. But when the thing comes out, and if it falls out and there's no parent home, they're going to scream as much or harder than ever. And there's nothing upstairs in that man's head, and he's really sick. Now, there's one interesting article in the San Francisco Chronicle that many of you in the East and elsewhere don't get that is very pertinent to a lot of today's problems. It was written by Warren Hinkle, Hinkle's journal, Where Are Harvey Milk's Clothes? This has to do with the murder of the supervisor in San Francisco, Harvey Milk, and Mayor George Moscone in San Francisco, both killed the same day by Dan White. Now, there's a play that opened up in the Bay Area, and a listener, subscriber to World Watchers, is acting in that play. And he called me. Originally, he wanted Steve Dobbins, who wrote the play, to come down and see me, but they never did, and they ordered my tapes on Jonestown and Dan White and the Dan White murder. And the play that Steve Dobbins wrote is called The Dan White Incident. It didn't do well in San Francisco, but it opened in L.A., and it's doing very well there, partly because it was just the time Dan White had moved to L.A., but the interest is down there. Maybe it's too close to home to San Francisco, but they should have seen it. And I was asking Jim, how was the play going? And he said it was fine, except that there was one part that the night they opened, they got an injunction from the coroner that they couldn't have the play. And I might have mentioned it on the program to you before in the past, how there was a mutilation of the genitals of Moscone and Milk. Harvey Milk was a homosexual. But if there was a mutilation of the genitals, if I was told, or this is what he said, and I think I shared it with you before, that Moscone was forced to on hands and knees. Remember that broadcast? Some of you heard it, some of you are new listeners. Walk like a dog and shot up the ass. Well, this is what he was told, that there was this stomping on the genitals of Harvey Milk and shooting the mayor, making him do this, identical to what the Nazis do in Argentina that Mr. Timmerman had referred to. Okay. Now, when the play opened, it brought up the controversy, and they had to take it out of the play in San Francisco, but they included it in Los Angeles. But now, the question came up because of the play, where are the clothing that were worn by Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone? And this article says that coroner Boyd G. Stevens, Stephanes, says he will not tell anybody, even the police, where the clothes are. Now, the implications of this are tremendous, because before I go into that story, let me remind you that there were accusations that a second gun was shot in the Ambassador Hotel. The man was identified as Thane, Cesar. He has even made a movie and a record talking about the gun going off and how he hated the Kennedys, and racial slurs that the Kennedys were giving the country to them. Now, Thane Cesar was behind Robert Kennedy, and after Robert Kennedy died, the coroner's office or somebody took the sleeve of Robert Kennedy's coat and the shirt sleeve and the ceiling panel, so that if the trajectory were a shot from the back straight up to the ceiling, it would show a second gun, because Sirhan was in front of Robert Kennedy. Not only did they get rid of the gun, but the sleeve was cut off, and it's never been an issue. Yet Warren Hinkle should go down to L.A. It's been written up in the literature on the Robert Kennedy assassination, but never become a major issue. So, and then to get to the John Kennedy assassination, and I did a story, as a matter of fact, I wrote up a long time ago, and was going to give it to Rebel, on the clothing of John Connally, that when the Warren Commission had the FBI and the doctors testifying about the bullet directions of John Connally, because he said they were different bullets than killed John Kennedy, and that would mean an extra gunman, because of the time sequence, Oswald couldn't have gotten over that many shots. And the doctors doing the surgery claimed and intimated that there was a different kind of an entry from outside into the sleeve of John Connally and into the trousers than the same bullet that our senator from Pennsylvania, Arlen Specter, says went from behind John Kennedy into the sleeve and into the thigh and out on the stretcher. So the doctors, in frustration for the Warren Commission, said, where are the clothes, the coat, the shirt, and the pants of John Connally to check the trajectory? And the FBI said they were destroyed by dry clinging. And then I began a long pursuit through all the evidence went to the Congressman Henry Gonzalez's apartment in Washington, D.C., where it was sent out to a dry cleaner. I believe it was Gonzalez. I better take that back till I check it out. It was either Yarborough or Gonzalez. I haven't read that or looked at that for about 5 or 6 years, but it would have proven a second gunman in that case. And it was important to the John Kennedy case that clothing be destroyed. And it was important to the Robert Kennedy case that the clothing be destroyed, because it would be a conspiracy in both places. But now we get to the question of the clothing here, because if there was sexual mutilation of both people, then Dan White would be tried on a different charge, and he would not get off. And there is a different kind of a charge for doing that, and he would go back to jail and maybe never get out. So the question of the clothing came out, and then Mayor Dianne Feinstein, who is a perfect patsy, who took over George Mosconi's job, intervened with the coroner, with Stevens, and said that she declined to say where the clothing was. Now, the coroner's action has set off a problem. The attorney for Harvey Milk's estate, John Wall, W-A-H-L, said that this is appalling and bizarre. I called Wall. Again, it's a case of my getting into something and people don't understand what I'm talking about. I talked to him as soon as I heard this and told him about the similarities and he should get the clothing. But that was almost a year ago or a half a year ago, and now they're concerned. And the roommate of Harvey Milk, Joseph Scott Smith, wants the clothing. And the coroner has said, I will destroy them. The coroner threatened to shut down the play, and he said Mr. Stevens is a public employee paid by the city of San Francisco, and he said that my position would be that the clothes would never be returned. I want assurance that the clothes wouldn't end up in a sideshow to become like Billy the Kid's pistol. I personally would not want to see a mannequin dressed, and he said that he would like to destroy them. And Mr. Smith, who responded, said it's not Billy the Smith, it's more like the Martin Luther King assassination be a proper analogy, having the clothes around of Harvey Milk. So the coroner there is threatening, and he said that he plans at some point to destroy the clothing. He's unimpressed that the clothing belongs to somebody else. So again, vital evidence 3 times in political murders in the state of California, run by coroners and people that take over the job afterwards, like Feinstein. Conventions coming up in that city, it'd be a good thing if people up there had the energy to organize and bring this out. Now, there's another story in the Chronicle just today that was shocking. There's news from the last week that's piled up, but some of these stories are just so outrageous. Well, the officials debate the covert hit teams to kill terrorists. The Reagan administration is wondering whether the CIA or the Defense Department, the Army, on U.S. installation, should be allowed to just kill on sight terrorists. That they said there's so many terrorists around that the CIA, Mr. Casey pretends that we don't have hit squads. He says it would be dangerous, like the revelations of trying to kill Cuban President Fidel Castro. But it's worse than that. The excuse is that there's Iranians and there's Syrians and there's these PLO and the people from Libya, and there's all these hit teams. So should we have an Air Force or a three-man hit team ourselves that just goes out, a commando strike team that kills the terrorists. Now, the implications are terrible because we had 4 incidences, one after the other, that I thought were provocateur areas. And I mentioned the Korean airline that was a total lie and fraud, the way it came down, the downing of Larry McDonald, and the incident in Burma, the killing of the Korean visitors, heads of state, and the Kuwait bombing, the U.S. Kuwait bombing, and in Lebanon, synchronized with the Grenada invasion, the way that our embassy there was shot down. Now, just 2 of those things I'll update with you tonight. One is in the Washington Post this last week. The authors of the KAL article say the agents were warned of espionage law violations. In Denver, Colorado, 2 people, Tom Bernard and T. Edward Eskelson, Eskelson, many of you have heard their names, were on the air and wrote an article saying that the United States version of the tragedy of the Korean airline was incomplete and misleading, and they urged for a full disclosure, as well as another member of the CIA who urged for full disclosure before Reagan and his administration get gun crazy and try to get away with this. You see, we could have, again, if somebody really wanted to, use it as a provocation for a nuclear first against the Soviet Union because a civilian plane went down. And one of these days, that's what's going to happen. Well, the National Security Agency has threatened these men. They've gone to their attorney. They said that you use classified facts pertaining to national security, and they've scared them, possible with arrest. Ronald Reagan wants a law to go through that if you write anything you knew regarding the intelligence community for the rest of your life, that you are subject to prosecution. So that these 2 men were trying to explain the nature of those RC-135 flights, and they had flown them themselves. And they were taken to task, they were threatened, they had to get a lawyer, and they may be charged of espionage law violations. So when a person is part of an administration and they do their job and they leave their job, and then they see something is wrong, they can go to jail for life if they speak up. If they see their own government is lying, like the Secret Service agent that was sent to Springfield, Missouri, bolden because he knew that there were lies about the protection of John Kennedy. If you see something that's wrong at any time in your lifetime when you're employed by people doing a lot of bad things, you're subject to being imprisoned yourself and heavy fines. Another story came out in the Washington Post. Burma accuses some of their own people of aiding in the North Korean bombing. When that bombing attack took place, some low-level Burmese officials were involved in other citizens of Burmese intelligence, and they quickly gave the death penalty to a couple of North Koreans that were sentenced to death on December the 9th, and then they find out that at the time of these killings, at a ceremony October the 9th, when 21 persons were killed, that there were people from the Burmese government that were involved, that they took bribes, that they allowed saboteurs to come ashore, that they had visited the port, that they were part of the entire sabotage, and they worked with the Burmese government. So what looks like a North Korean incident, which North Korea had no reason to do because Burma was one of the few countries that was trading and recognizing them, and then all of a sudden they called it off after the bombings, that there were people inside the Burmese government that were involved. And the first easiest thing is to do the death penalty on the so-called terrorists. Now, we could have a so-called terrorist invasion of some sort at the Olympic Games in Los Angeles or anywhere at the UN or in Washington, and it could be identical to Hitler's Reichstag, where Hitler sets off the destruction of his own building and then uses it to round up people for the rest of his life or his administration, whether he died or went on to somewhere else. The horrors that followed began with the Reichstag as an excuse to round up. So when we get these hit teams, we can get a provocateur to do the job, and again, under the use of mind control or zombies or kamikaze, then kill that person and do the political act that follows. And the suggestion is, should our Pentagon have commando hit teams? There's also an article about the Kuwait, several articles about the Kuwait embassy, how they asked for help. They knew that it wasn't protected. And 4 months before the terrorist bombing, December the 12th, there was a detailed intelligence report on the dangers to the embassy, but they left it unguarded and let it be bombed so that they could make a list of the terrorist groups. Now, the Los Angeles Times has a story, or this is a week ago, 100 terror groups listed as the Olympic Games approach. They have a potential threat of 50 major terrorist organizations and 50 smaller groups. Would you believe that out of those 100 groups, I'll bet you 78% are CIA. They even cite Carlos. Here is a history in the Washington Post and New York Times of Carlos the terrorist working with Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and Samuel Cummings of the CIA, floating on Cummings' yacht in London and Cummings' headquarters in Monte Carlo, and they're saying that the international terrorist will be out with his gang. Can you imagine landing in Los Angeles, and we're here for the Olympic Games. Now, this article goes on these smaller groups, and it says the dangerous thing is that these are hired guns, and they'll work for any extremist group. In other words, if there's 100 terrorist groups, that you can use a hired gun, so there's endless people that would shoot. Why don't they want to solve the Olympic Games by going back to George Habash and the Munich Games in Germany, and they would come to the solution of where the terrorists come from. They come from the CIA and Nazi Germany, and they were patterned after the Tsarist terrorist groups that went around in the villages and scared people and kept control through terror. They're looking for this gang of 100. It's just pathetic, and I'm sure their names are into the computer of Western Goals and the LAPD. And they're creating a script. I mean, if you want to talk about a fiction script, just like the SLA, if you want to know what kind of terrorists there are, I reprinted, and I still have some of the article. The article I did the whole one on the SLA is the CIA, written 10 years ago, and it goes into the Olympic Games and the way that our whole California Department and Ronald Reagan, the Justice Department, the CIA, and the Operation Chaos and COINTEL program, and the MK Ultra, all worked together and created, which wasn't a terrorist group at all. It was 4 college graduates from Indiana and Bloomington, Indiana, who came out here and went into some prison movements and messed around with legitimate workers like the United Farm Workers and the United Prisoners Union, and they cornered the various radicals that existed and get them longer sentences, or people like, the ones that were working with them from Berkeley, they were killed. A few people that were genuine in some kind of a movement got swept up with these others from the CIA. Ms. Moon and a few of them that got like a vacuum. They got sucked in the excitement, and they were killed. There are some terrorists on the run. There are legitimate terrorists now. Incidentally, this is the first time in 3 weeks that real terrorists came out of the woodwork, and this is what they may be worrying about. Not those phony terrorists with the names set up by the CIA, but in Madrid, 4 men gunned down a former general for General Francisco Franco. And in Paris, they gunned down the head of the Savak, the torture machine for the Shah. This is a new turning point. Maybe they'll make a movie called Turning Point. Some of the oppressors, I wondered how they lived so long. How did they ever live so long? Do you realize that the oppressors, 2 of them, got knocked off in the last 3 weeks? And a lot of the arms and the weapons, similar to Hitler's, SS and his commando teams, want to wipe out maybe people who are going after, maybe someday they'll find the Kissingers and the Kramers and the Haigs and the people, Brzezinskis, and the real warriors, the people that order the bloodbaths of these countries. Maybe somebody will get smart and realize where the blood is flowing from, where the orders come from. But they realize late, it's a long time since Franco, but this general got his this last week, and it may be a lesson to a few of those others. There's hundreds and thousands of those people around, and it may be a lesson to the people that ran the Savak for the Shah when he was gunned down in Paris. I am sure from this point on that their names are now on lists. I am sure there has to be some point in history where people wake up, the victims, and say, I've had enough already. I don't know what it's going to take, but there's going to be some dues to be paid and some blood to flow on the other side. It's been too easy so far for the Richard Nixons and the Henry Kissingers to run this world, and Brzezinski's and the Fritz Kramers. It's been far too easy for Ronald Reagan to make this blood flow. And someday, I don't know who or when or how, but when it starts in Spain and when it starts in Paris, getting the head of the Shah's Sauvage in Paris. It can't be too long before this begins to become a pattern, and the vengeance then will happen. Now, the orderly process is like in Argentina to put the 3 former presidents on trial for murder. That's what we should do in the United States right now. Forget the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Start with Dorothy Hunt's plane crash. But put them, Gerald Ford, and also George Bush for the murder of Orlando Letelier. He's directly responsible as CIA director. Knew it ahead, knew it afterwards. George Bush and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, and charge them with cover-up of the past assassinations, the Warren Commission job, and lying about Oswald's diary, the planted evidence, and the media propaganda that Ford used. All of them have been responsible for a part of the murder of the president and a senator and civil rights leaders. They've worked with the assassins, and eventually somebody, believe it or not, their names will go down for what they are, and they'll get out of the pages of the beautiful people, and they'll be recognized for what they are. Now, Jack Anderson had a 5-part series. This week was the 5th part of his story that he's doing on fascism. In fact, I called the office in Washington, D.C., and spoke to the fellow who did this story, and I said, have you seen The Rebel? And he said he bought a couple issues, but he didn't know about the article I had written for Rebel, and I said I would send it to him, and a lot of other material. This is what he had this week. The Spirit of Nazism Lives. This is the 5th part on fascism, and the San Francisco Chronicle called it Anti-Semitic Death Squads. It talks about the jackboot, the swastikas that are appearing in South America and elsewhere, that Ronald Reagan is growing concerned. He's worked with these people. He's concerned. The World Anti-Communist League, that's what put Ronald Reagan in power. And he knew they had the swastikas, and he knew they have the jackboots, and he knew they were Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele and Walter Ralph and the whole gang. He's Martin Bormann. They funded this administration. Licio Gelli went back and forth between Argentina and Italy, between Franco and Mussolini and Hitler, and then was at Reagan's inauguration. They have taken the money from these people and they've run with them. Now they say they're getting more anti-Semitic. Honduras, Argentina mentions Paraguay, Chile, and the men run out of Guadalajara, Mexico. Remember in The Rebel I wrote about Oaxaca, Mexico, and Albert Osborne and Permindex. And it tells about the wealthy Arabs giving the money in Mexico to the World Anti-Communist League. Yeah, Otto von Bolschwing was active with the Grand Mufti over there in Palestine before it became Israel. And Hitler had a good, strong organization with the Gemayel family over there, and also in various countries, Libya. And there's no difference. The CIA has worked in all the Saudi Arabian countries. They trained Nasser. Galen trained Nasser. He trained Sadat. He trained Gaddafi. It isn't just, it mentions the PLO. It isn't just South America. Wait till they take their coats off, and then you'll know where the real Henry Kissinger is. He put those people in, and Fritz Kramer and John McCloy put them in. And this article tells about ever since World War II, these Nazis have won a lot of attention. Mengele was honored in Paraguay. Adolf Eichmann, refuge in Argentina. Klaus Barbie, an advisor to the Bolivian government. The Hitler 1,000-year Reich is well and alive. And this is part 5, carried and syndicated in 300 papers. It is alive because they took hundreds of millions of dollars that I mentioned last week, and they took people from the United States Army that was in the OSS, then the CIC, the investigation group, and they also took Henry Kissinger's, his mentor at Harvard was a Dr. William Yandell Elliott, who was in the OSS, who worked overseas with these societies out of Sicily and Berlin and ran the Harvard Department of History. Well, the chickens not only have come home to roost, but they've laid some pretty strong eggs. And an example of that, again, just in closing, is how fast Larry Flint and his wife went under with these ridiculously long sentences. People are out of jail for mass murders and walk in the streets for all kinds of things. These people have been treated with the MK Ultra, and Rebel is closed. Rebel had good articles, even a 2-part on colonial dignitat and the Nazis. But the Jack Anderson called is Caring, I guess where Rebel leaves off, and they'll be doing more, and other magazines will be doing more, and of course I'll be doing more, but I won't do it anymore on this evening because it's over. And now I must stop. It's Mae Brussell. It's exactly 9. So it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.